This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Click the link below to start browsing a better, safer internet, or stick around to the end of the video to learn more. So I'm sitting at home just reorganizing my Taylor Swift albums when suddenly the phone rings. I pick it up and the voice at the other end says, "It's me, Mario." And I'm like, "Oh my God, Chris Pratt, I love you." And then he says, "No, it's me, Mario from Nintendo. Do you want to come and play Tears of the Kingdom early, ? And I'm like, "Tears of the Kingdom? What's that? Never heard of it." That's a lie, of course. I totally lost my shit and booked the next flight to Melbourne. Because it was there, under a cloudy Melbourne sky, in a lofty hotel room in Crown Towers, that I was among the first people in the world to go hands-on with The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. My time with the game was actually divided into 3 categories. The first was a hands-off session where a representative from Nintendo played through an early section of the game, explaining to me a number of the new systems and gameplay mechanics introduced to Tears of the Kingdom. They were actually playing through a similar area that Aonuma was playing through in his hands-on demonstration of the game, you know, the part where he builds the speedboat. The Nintendo rep showed me a different way to solve that same puzzle, but we'll come back to the detail on that later. The second part of the session was hands-on, where I was in the Sky Isles. It was a chance to experiment with the sandbox and solve a number of puzzles in that surrounding area. There was also a boss battle there, which was really impressive. Sadly, I wasn't allowed to capture any of that stuff, so I'll just have to recount it to you. The third part of my session was another hands-on block, and I could capture that. And can I just say, I was stunned that Nintendo would allow capture at this event because, yeah man, Nintendo are usually pretty safe with how they market their titles, and capture definitely introduces an element of risk since who knows what might get captured. Still, I think it speaks to Nintendo's confidence in the title, and yeah, having played it, I'm not remotely surprised about that confidence. This third section I could play through was on the ground, so not in the Sky Isles. There was a tower in front of me, and the Nintendo rep said, "You have to get into that tower however you see fit." And I took that as a challenge to come up with the dumbest way possible to enter that tower. I feel like I succeeded, not only because my harebrained scheme actually worked, but because the Nintendo rep said, "Yep, that's definitely the dumbest way I've seen anyone accomplish that objective." Okay, he didn't actually say dumb, he said interesting, but I could tell what he was thinking. Important to note that I did not experience any cutscenes, any major characters, any story reveals, any major quest objectives, or dungeons, or temples, or whatever they end up being called. This session was exclusively focused on the sandbox. So, with all that set up out the way, what did I think of this tiny slice of The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom? We have all seen the trailers, and we have all marveled at the ability of Link to MacGyver a speedboat out of some shit he found lying around on the ground, but let me tell you, you have absolutely no idea what is in store for you when it comes to this sandbox. Even based on this small section that I have seen, I cannot believe what Nintendo have built here. This sandbox is unfucking believable. The number of things that you are able to build, the process that you go through to build them, the different ways that each of your abilities can be used in exploration, traversal, puzzle solving, and combat. I simply cannot fathom the mind or the minds that it took to create all of this, and I shudder to imagine the code base that makes it all possible. In 2 hours, I feel like I experienced 6 games worth of mechanics. Every new objective I encountered, I poked and prodded to see what the sandbox could withstand, and every single time it cackled back, more than able to handle anything I threw at it. The amount of ingenuity and experimentation that is possible here is just out of this world. There are definitely still many unanswered questions about this, namely, how much does Tears of the Kingdom respond to the complaints of Breath of the Wild being too sandbox driven and not focusing enough on the Legend of Zelda part, the mythic quests, the grand temples and dungeons, etc. It's clear that Nintendo are definitely doubling down on the sandbox, but it's unclear if they haven't also buttressed that other side of the game as well. There are also plenty of question marks around performance, which I'll tell you right now, wasn't great. And yeah, it's not a final build, yada yada, but we all know the limits of the Switch at this point, and Tears of the Kingdom appears to be pushing up hard against them. But even with these outstanding questions, 2 hours with this title has already left me convinced that this is not resting on Breath of the Wild's laurels at all. Even in this tiny window, this was one of the most flexible, responsive, and creative sandboxes I've ever experienced in a video game, and I cannot imagine what the full experience has in store for us. Okay, so let's do this in the same order that Nintendo took me through it, because I feel like that's the best way to build an understanding of the potential of this sandbox. By the way, the footage throughout this video is going to be a mix of trailers, B-roll provided by Nintendo, and my own recorded footage. So the hands-off demo began at that same lake that Aonuma was trying to cross in the gameplay showcase that he did. He built a raft comprised of 3 logs and 2 fans, stuck them all together, and off he went. Here in this hands-off walkthrough, I was able to see firsthand how all of this works and ask questions about it. Hitting the left bumper brings up Link's ability menu, and there's a number of them at the start, and more become available later. The ability that powers the building is called Ultra Hand, and it allows you to pick up and move objects of all sizes, and it also allows you to connect those objects to other objects. This is not a totally free-form connection, mind you. Each object is modeled to include certain connection points, so this stuff kind of clicks together like Lego rather than being stuck together with glue. As for the basic materials you can use to build, they're going to come in various forms. Aonuma had a couple of logs just laying around here, but what if you didn't have logs? Well, in my own hands-on demo, I was faced with a puzzle where I needed a log, but there weren't any around. There were, however, some trees, but I didn't have an axe. So I had a stick, I found a nearby rock, I was able to fuse the two of those together to create an axe, at which point I could chop down a tree, and I now had myself a lovely log. That's an example of creating my own building materials from the environment, but what you'll also find scattered throughout the landscape are piles of building materials. I won't spoil while they're there, but they're there for a reason, and it's literally just lumber and wheels and other basic building materials, and you can do whatever you like with them. In this tower section, I found 2 of these resource piles quite nearby, so I'm assuming that we can expect to see these pretty regularly throughout the landscape, giving us plenty of opportunity to build to our heart's content. So those are the base materials, but what about these fans that Aonuma attached to the back? What's the deal with those? These mechanical contraptions are called Zonai artifacts, and they're the remnants of the Zonai tribe, a group introduced in Breath of the Wild. It's unclear what sort of presence they'll have here in Tears of the Kingdom, so I won't speculate, but I can confirm that their technology is alive and well, and basically anything mechanical that you see in Tears of the Kingdom is courtesy of them. So Aonuma had these fans sitting around on the ground, but how do you get them? Well, you're not going to believe this, but you get them from a giant gacha dispenser. As Link explores Hyrule, he'll find these things called Zonai charges. He can then drop these into a dispenser and it will spit out a random assortment of Zonai devices. I can't show you them all here because Nintendo has asked me not to, but yeah, if I pick these up, I'm going to find rockets and fans and joysticks allowing me to steer vehicles, etc. It's all random as well, like I can't choose what I want, and Nintendo PR weren't able to confirm for me if we can build specific Zonai devices later in the game. So I think this is all random and you need to be able to cobble together contraptions based on what you have to hand, rather than always choosing to build X, Y, or Z thing because you keep building the same essential components. In this way, the Zonai build economy reflects the weapons economy, where weapon durability is forcing you to switch between different weapons rather than allowing you to ride a handful of weapons throughout the entire playthrough. Spoiler alert, weapon durability is definitely back, but it's different here this time around for interesting reasons. We'll come back to that when we talk about combat. So back to crossing this lake, the Nintendo rep built the same log raft that Aonuma did, but instead of attaching fans to it, they had some rockets in their inventory, and so that's what they took out, they dropped them on the floor, picked them up with Ultra Hand, and stuck them to the back of their raft. When they did that though, they did something really interesting. They angled them up slightly. This is where I came to understand how important orientation is when connecting objects. You hold the right bumper and use the D-pad to spin objects this way or that, and their orientation has a big impact on where that object will go. So because these rockets were attached angled upwards, the raft did not go straight across the water, it actually went up in the air at a 45-degree angle, and the raft essentially flew over the lake rather than gliding across the water. It was something I encountered myself when I was exploring the Sky Isles. You'll find these large floating blocks. They're essentially zero buoyancy. They won't rise or fall except when something pushes or pulls them. So I get on the first of these and I want to cross toward another isle, and since it's directly ahead of me, I can point the rockets in that direction and off I go. Later, I wanted to access an isle that was above me, so I would attach the rockets at an angle, and then that is where I would go. This is where we can really start to understand the importance of physics in this sandbox. Do not imagine that every item is programmed to go in a specific direction no matter what. Rather, every object is subject to the laws of physics. You know how I know that? Watch this. Do you see the way that glider is flying away? It doesn't go in a straight line. It undulates up and down because that is how aerodynamics works. If you throw a paper plane, it will do this when it loses most of its forward propulsion. Nintendo could have just made this go in a straight line. But they didn't. They modeled the physics for how this object would move through space, and that is just one example. I will give you another. Toward the end of my demo, I was like, I'm gonna build me a rocket car, and I thought it would be cool to attach 2 flame jets at the front. These items are essentially just flamethrowers. They shoot out flame in a straight line. So I built my rocket car, and in my head, when I turned it on, I was imagining that I'd be screaming down Hyrule Field with flames shooting out in front of me like some badass Mad Max Fury Road moment. Turns out that didn't quite end up going as I had planned, because fire is modeled realistically just like everything else, so I ended up setting my own car on fire. So everything here is modeled to be as responsive as possible, subject to the laws of physics, and I think one of the biggest byproducts of that is how surprising and funny all of this can be. I really did have a very clear vision in my mind of how all of this would go down, but because of the way Nintendo have modeled physics in this game, it turns out my prediction was hilariously wrong. This physics modeling also extends to things like propulsion and what's known as zonai charge. Zonai devices have stamina in the form of zonai charge, and part of the gameplay loop here is to steadily increase that charge by various means so your contraptions can remain powered for longer. Here, with this dumbass flying balloon contraption I made, had it more zonai charge, I would have been able to stay in the air for longer, but instead, my flying machine morphs from hot air balloon into lead balloon. Soon after that, it was my turn to get hands-on with the controller, and my hands-on experience kicked off in the Sky Isles. The controls are very familiar, by the way, so if you've played Breath of the Wild, nothing to really shout out there. At this point, I was able to test out the Ascend ability. This is the one that flies you up through the ceiling for some reason. Interestingly, this ability has great utility during combat. Later, when I was storming that tower I mentioned earlier, there were a number of raised platforms that I could either climb up to with a ladder, or I could just ascend like this. This was the portion of the game where I was tasked with storming that tower. Again, I wanted to do this in the stupidest way possible, so I looked around and found some building materials, and I checked my inventory and I found I had some new zonai stuff in there. One of them was the flame jet I mentioned earlier, and the other one was a balloon that would rise when you pumped heat into it. I first tried to combine that balloon with a cooking stove, but that didn't do anything, so I then committed to the flame jet balloon combo, put it on a plank of wood I found, put a backing on it to hold a fan for some forward propulsion. The last thing I added was a control unit, which was essentially a joystick that allows me to steer my mechanical monstrosity. When all that was done, it was time for my maiden flight. So I learned a lot from this failed attempt, namely, this thing turns like an oil tanker. I'd imagine that it would kind of turn on a dime, but this turn arc you saw, that was me hard locking to the left, trying to steer toward the tower. Since I didn't have anything to improve that arc, I thought I would just point myself at the objective for the next flight. Here's how that went. Again, more learning. I learned that I didn't have enough upward propulsion to get me up to the tower, so what did I do? I put this thing up on blocks, so to speak. I attached some fans to the bottom of it, one of them upside down, so I had to fix that. I pointed my upgraded ship toward the objective, and it was time for round 3. And that is how I got to the tower. There were a bunch of enemies guarding that I could have fought my way through, but I found this way slower, way stupider way to get the job done. And it made me very happy, and I think it made the Nintendo PR rep very concerned that they had invited the wrong person to this hands-on opportunity. After that time, I was able to reload this checkpoint so I could try a more direct approach, and this is where I got to experiment with the way combat works in Tears of the Kingdom. And one of the things the Nintendo rep said at the start of the presentation is that you shouldn't just be going into combat the same way you would in Breath of the Wild. They were very clear that you really need to make use of all of your abilities if you're going to be effective. I got a sense of that right off the bat fighting my first moblin. I wasn't doing much damage, my weapon broke really fast, and it was clear right away that I was doing something wrong. Things got even worse when I encountered this guy. Fully armored up as he was, my sword swings were doing literally 0 damage. This is where we get to the exciting world of Fuse. This is an ability on your wheels, same as Ultra Hand, and it lets you fuse almost anything to your weapon, shield, or arrows. We've already seen from Aonuma the different effects that fusing can have on arrows. He fuses some eyeballs to an arrow to make them track targets. I was able to test out fusing a bunch of minerals. The ruby, for example, makes things go boom. Fusing white choo-choo jelly will give you frozen arrows, while the yellow jelly will electrify your targets, creating a small AoE as it does so. Fusing a topaz also electrifies the target, but creates a much larger AoE when it does so. I learned that the hard way. Fuse starts to get really wild when it comes to your melee weapon and shield though, so the basic principle is that if it isn't nailed down, you can probably fuse it onto your weapon or shield. See this giant spiky wrecking ball thing 4 times the size of Link? You can fuse that. That is how I was able to create a weapon capable of breaking that armored moblin from earlier. This turns the sword from a sharp weapon into a blunt weapon, capable of breaking armor. It also adds a large amount of attack power, and I found some items dropped by enemies that would double or even triple my weapon's attack power with one quick fuse. It also massively increases the durability of a weapon. Base durabilities are very low, perhaps even more so than in Breath of the Wild, but don't quote me on that. But the fuse ability is a really quick shortcut to substantially more durability. As a brief note, once you've fused an item to a weapon, you can no longer fuse any other item to that weapon. It is a permanent process, and at that point, your weapon's durability cannot be restored by subsequent fuses. The constant discarding and replacement of weapons is very much a thing in Tears of the Kingdom, just as it was in Breath of the Wild. So if it was a deal breaker for you there, it's probably going to be a deal breaker for you here too. Coming back to what I said earlier about being able to fuse almost anything, yeah, you can. I mean, you saw me running around with a giant dynamite barrel fused to my shield. Here's what happens when enemies hit that. If I fuse the flame-throwing Zonai device, my shield will become a flamethrower every time I guard with it. Same thing if I attach a fan. Every time I guard, I would start blowing stuff away. I found some mine carts earlier in the session where I couldn't capture. And yeah, you can fuse an actual mine cart onto your shield. It just kind of shrinks it down, and so you're sitting there guarding with this miniature mine cart. It's very odd. But yeah, you can immediately see how much this one ability opens up the combat sandbox, because you've got the ability to combine weapons, raw materials, things you find lying around, Zonai devices, and so much more. And each one of those things is going to add this totally new, almost unpredictable dimension to combat every single time. And that's not even counting the other major ability, Recall. It's rewind time, everybody. Just as you can fuse basically anything that's not nailed down, you can recall almost any non-living thing that moves. This will rewind that item back through time while everything else continues forward through time. So here, as I made this approach to the tower, I was able to use this spiking wrecking ball as not only something I could fuse, but as something I could just send back and forth up the ramp as moblins tried to hold that position. Recall can also be used against anything the enemy tries to throw at you, like this. Recall is also very useful when you make a mistake. At one point, I accidentally threw my weapon at some rockets, which sent a platform racing off. Luckily, I was able to react and recall it. Crisis averted. That's probably a neat segue into the final part of my hands-on demo, some more time spent in the Sky Isles. So you have to imagine that while you've got this huge landmass to explore on the ground, floating above that is an archipelago of islands, some of them only a few meters wide, while others are massive explorable spaces. I obviously have no idea what the Sky Isles hold in their entirety, but this specific section was essentially a series of puzzles, each of which rewarded me with important resources and materials. This one was that log puzzle I mentioned earlier, where I had to somehow keep the sluice gate open, so I had to fuse an axe, chop down a tree to create a log, ultra hand it to another log to make a crossbeam large enough, and then ultra hand the log to the gate to hold it in place. There were a few more puzzles that I did like that, and I sort of got the vibe that that's Tears of the Kingdom's deal. Like Breath of the Wild had the exploration and the shrines, which were puzzle boxes that relied on your abilities like Magnesis, Remote Bomb, and Stasis, and Nintendo effectively crafted a series of challenges that asked you to use those abilities in a variety of creative ways. Tears of the Kingdom is just quadrupling down on that. Link has a similar number of abilities at his disposal, but the nature of those abilities is vastly more flexible in their function and effect. Fuse essentially lets you craft an impossible number of weapons, armor, and arrow types, and Ultra Hand lets you create so many different contraptions to fit so many purposes. This rendition of Hyrule and the Sky Isles feels like it takes the puzzle challenges we found in the shrines of Breath of the Wild and just peppers them throughout the actual world. Which brings me to one observation that I came to, which is that this is a fairly finicky game to play. Games like God of War or The Witcher, or even classic Zelda games like Ocarina, they aren't finicky. You just explore the world and you beat up some bad guys. Breath of the Wild was obviously finicky in its own way, owing to things like weapon durability or the abilities you're using while you're solving puzzles, but Tears of the Kingdom is definitely a few orders of magnitude above that. Most of what I encountered required me to stop and think, to go in and out of my inventory, to use the building system, which is intuitive, don't get me wrong, but it still takes time to snap stuff together and orient it correctly, etc. You know, as I was playing, I was like, this feels like a survival game almost. The need to scavenge for everything you'll use was already in Breath of the Wild, but the fusing system and the Ultra Hand build system all gave me the feelings I would get while playing stuff like Valheim or V Rising or whatever. That feeling of taking stock of the resources you have to hand to see what you can cobble together with them, or picking up and discarding things based on how useful you think they might be in the future. Now, I absolutely love that feeling, but I can already tell there's going to be some people who look at this and think, nah, that's too much work for me. If you just want to roll through an action-adventure game that involves swinging a sword a bunch of times, then Tears of the Kingdom is not likely going to be that because it's so invested in these building, survival, and physics-based gameplay systems. Something else that may give people pause is performance on the Switch. So to be clear, it's not the worst thing ever. I do not expect that this will be a deal breaker for anyone who is interested to play this video game. However, the number of frame rate drops that I experienced in just this slice of the demo was more than a few. The question I always ask when looking at this stuff is, does it affect the game or is it just a visual annoyance? I think it affects the game here in two important ways. Number one, the game does become manifestly less responsive when that frame rate drops because the frame rate wasn't that high to begin with, and combat and exploration start to feel pretty crappy when they're running at like 15 frames or whatever it chugs down to. Secondly, and I think more importantly, these frame drops remind you that this is still a video game, like a piece of software. And I know that sounds lame, but it's such a special, magical place, Hyrule, and this journey that you're on is so transportive and immersive. To have these moments where the frame rate just kind of dies a little bit, it does take you out, and it's a bit of a bummer. But like I said, that's not going to be enough to ruin what I anticipate is going to be a pretty extraordinary experience. The level of imagination that is coursing through every single bit of this is so humbling to experience for yourself. I could have spent hours on just this tiny slice of the game that they gave me, experimenting with every fuse combination, building ever elaborate contraptions, solving each puzzle and combat challenge in a completely new way. There are basically zero hands-on opportunities where I could have said the same thing, and I haven't even seen any of the story stuff yet, the major characters, any of the dungeons, or any of the more elaborate locations. It's just the sandbox I've seen for now, but it's so dense and so promising, and when you fuse that with your knowledge of this series and the exceptionally high bar it always maintains, it's difficult not to get very, very excited. Unsurprisingly, Tears of the Kingdom looks to be another classic in the making, and I cannot wait to get lost in Hyrule all over again. Here's a question for you. Do you lock your door at night when you sleep? Do you lock your car when you hop out to go to the grocery store? Do you put your stuff in a locker when you go to the gym? Of course you do. It makes sense to secure your valuables, right? So let me ask you this. What are you doing to secure your online data? Because believe me, that is very, very valuable to the right people. Online security is a new vital frontier. We can't be cavalier about our passwords, our credit card data, our personal information. It's really ripe for the picking if we aren't careful. And if you want to browse a better, safer internet, then you really ought to check out ExpressVPN. I mean, take security and privacy, for example. ExpressVPN encrypts all of your online data, making it significantly harder to be intercepted by people looking to nab your passwords or other personal information. If you want to remain more anonymous when browsing online, then a VPN is a must. It's an especially big risk if you ever use any public Wi-Fi networks like a library or school or a cafe. Those sorts of connections leave you particularly vulnerable, and ExpressVPN keeps you safe. The big one, for me at least, is being able to browse the internet and access content free from geo-blocking. So much stuff is geo-blocked here in Australia, and if I want to be able to watch whatever I want, then I need a VPN. I mean, I can't even subscribe to HBO here in Australia because we just don't have it here. So yeah, VPN is a must for me, otherwise I'm just missing out on too much stuff. ExpressVPN effectively tricks servers into thinking that I'm somewhere else. So me being in Australia can appear as though I'm using internet in the United States, for example, allowing me to access all of that geo-blocked content. Using streaming platforms without a VPN is like going to McDonald's but only being able to order from the breakfast menu. There's so much more content to enjoy when you're free of geo-blocks, and ExpressVPN lets you enjoy it. ExpressVPN is easy to install and use, plus you can use it on a variety of devices. To check it out, go to expressvpn.com/skillup, and if you sign up from that landing page, you'll get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN free. Thanks ExpressVPN for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.